Welcome to In the Gym. I'm your host, Michael Petrella. Today we have a very special guest, Randy Roach. Randy is the only guest that we can say came for season 1, 2, and now 3. We're very lucky to have his expertise. We went to social media to ask what our viewers want to see, and the number one request by a large margin was the Colorado experiment. So having someone with Randy's knowledge and his background in the history of the Iron Game is a blessing to all of us. Randy, thank you for being on the show again.
Right here. Thanks, Mike.
So there's going to be a lot of people who do know, but for those who don't, what was the Colorado experiment? When did it happen? What occurred?
The Colorado experiment took place through the month of May in 1973 at the Colorado State University's physiology laboratory, as they call it. It was conducted by Dr. Elliot Pleece. Excuse me. Dr. Pleece met Arthur Jones in 1971 when he went down to Florida. It just happened to be, I think, just a week before Casey Viator was going to compete and win the 1971 Mr. America. And Dr. Elliot Pleece was just blown away, not just by Casey's strength, but the fact that he had such muscle size, strength, flexibility, and muscular endurance. Because at that time, we thought you couldn't get that all in one package deal of training. You had to train specifically for cardiovascular, you got to train specifically for muscle, and then you had to do some type of flexibility routine just for your flexibility. But Arthur was touting at that time that he can do it all in one shot. So they had set up, Arthur wanted credibility, so he knew he just couldn't tout his own stuff. So having Dr. Pleece from the Colorado State University, it gave him more credibility, so they set it up for May of 1973 for a 4-week span to see how much muscle could be built in that period of time.
So essentially it was a case study, and they were looking at what kind of results they could produce in a short period of time.
Yeah.
So going into the study, what kind of shape was Arthur Jones and Casey Viator, who were the two models for the study, what kind of shape were they in? Because you had mentioned earlier, Casey was in tremendous physical shape in the 1971 Mr. America.
Yeah. It's probably best that we set a little bit more context before we, in terms of why Arthur wanted to do this.
Okay.
Because I think it's one of the questions we're going to talk, and you asked me, why did he want to do this?
Okay.
And Arthur was very smart. You and I have done an entire other show on him that people can watch to get more background on him, because he was quite the entrepreneur, quite the adventurer. But he wanted, I would say, in my opinion, a very hyperinflated marketing vehicle for his training ideology and his equipment, exercise equipment technology, that was at a time when weight-resistant exercise was about to break out into a whole new industries outside of just the Iron Game, which was bodybuilding, weightlifting, and powerlifting. And weight-resistant training was now being accepted more so, and these other industries were along the fields of strength coaching and rehabilitation. Now, at that period of time in the early 1970s, both pro and amateur sports were going under an enormous change. At the pro level, with television through the 60s, the commercial viability for pro sports, all athleticism, became much more because so many people were watching it right in their living rooms, right? Everybody's getting a TV. And with that more viewership came bigger money, bigger business, bigger politics. Even on the amateur level, that the long-standing control of amateur sports under the AAU, that was the Amateur Athletic Union, and the NCAA, that's the National Collegiate Amateur Association, they were going to be divested of their power over amateur athletics in the United States, and it was going to go over to the United States Olympic Committee. This was a major change. Part of it was due to the point at that period, there was a growing concern about one's health and fitness, and even in America's youth, and much to do with the poor performance in the 1972 Olympic Games, because America didn't do as well as they wanted to. And they were wondering about, okay, what can we do here? Hence the change in the amateur structure. And in 1972, they started the United States Sports Academy. You've heard of the American College of Sports Medicine, which was actually already existing, proliferated out. So resistance exercise is starting to get respected. And like I said, with these new fields into strength coaching and rehabilitation, Arthur wanted a big part of that. And that was, I think, his main reason to get a good marketing vehicle for that. At the same time, There were some strength testing tools coming in the game, specifically from the Lumex, the medical company, who had a Cybex. They just claimed they could measure the force output with their dynamometer, if you can say that one 5 times fast, right? And Arthur took issue with this. As you would know, he took issue with any strength testing tool all through the 1970s. But during that time, the Cybex unit, it only worked in what they call isokinetic, in a positive motion of an exercise. For example, when you lift a curl, when you come up, that's the positive. When you go down, that's the negative. It only worked in the positive, and Arthur took issue with that. And in the Colorado experiment, he wanted to show that his training ideology and his equipment using accentuated negatives, the lowering of a movement, was even superior than just the positive. So those were the main reasons for the Colorado experiment, a marketing vehicle, and to basically snub the entire industry, because his technology and ideology just ran totally opposite of what was going on at the time.
So that was fantastic information, and I think it gives a lot of context to the viewer of all the different things that may have been going on in Arthur Jones' head during that time. As you alluded to, he was making his own equipment. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the specialty equipment that he made specifically for the experiment.
Arthur was bringing into the game a whole different jargon of physics, torque, foot-pounds, all the dynamometers, like I just said before, tenths hours. Arthur believed that a barbell was inferior. He said it was a great tool up to that time, but it didn't give you consistent resistance through the motion. When the muscle works through its axis of motion, he believed that the resistance had to vary. The resistance had to vary according to your strength curve versus the resistance curve. Where a barbell, he said, was only direct when it was at 180 degrees in phase with gravity. When they were basically when you're at the parallel point, it's your static position. He said, the only time he thought the barbell was the most efficient. But it was more efficient than that. But his equipment, we're using cams, they were able to vary the resistance as the muscles move through the axis of motion. So basically, that technology was opposite what most people were using at that time in terms of barbells and dumbbells and universal machine, but it'll tie into some more equipment we can talk about in a minute in terms of what he was doing when you originally asked me what they were doing before the experiment started.
We're back with Randy Roach, author of the Muscle, Smoke, and Mirrors trilogy. Randy, we were just talking a little bit about the Nautilus machines that Arthur had made, but he made some very specific machines for the experiment that centered around negative-only training, or only lowering the resistance as opposed to having any sort of lifting. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about them.
Okay, as I mentioned earlier, Arthur took issue with Cybex and their isokinetic motion, where they only went through the positive lifting of the exercise. So Arthur wanted to see and prove that the negative was superior. He believed that the negative motion held 40% more strength than the positive motion, and the static, where the isometric part, was 20% more strength than what the positive had. So in the fall of 1972, Arthur wanted to see if he could bring his weight up again, because he had, being as busy as he was, he had kind of got out of shape. So he did, for a 7-week period, he did negative-only training, very heavy, accentuated negatives, where he would load himself up and just, for example, if he's doing a dip, he would just lower himself in the dip. He wouldn't do the positive. He did that for 7 weeks. At the same time, Casey Viator was also doing, from September into deep December, he too was working on a negative-only training routine, where he brought his body weight up to 200 pounds. Casey won the Mr. America at 218 pounds. Arthur got his weight up to 180 pounds in 1968, but he was only able to get his weight up in 1972 using negative training. He got his strength there, but his body weight only went up to 169 pounds. So at that time, nearing Christmas, there was an accident where Casey lost a part of his finger, and he couldn't train at all. And that's when Arthur was getting ready to set up for the Colorado experiment. Now, he wrote that he was going to do negative-only training through that month of May in 1973. But I speculate because he could not reach his weight that he had retained before, he decided to do both. Because at that time, he was working on some prototype machines that I believe you own all 5 of them. That were, correct me now if I'm wrong, he had one for the bicep curl,
Biceps,
triceps, shoulder, chest, and the multi-machine.
Yes.
All these machines would allow you one to use a foot pedal to assist you get into position, and then you control the lowering of the movement. So at that time, in the fall, I don't know if he had them all done, but I believe he had them all done for the Colorado experiment. But he decided to use both positive and negative movements for that experiment.
So as time progressed, we'll come back to the experiment in a minute. What do you feel was Arthur's continuing belief or continuing thought pattern as it pertained to negative-only training?
Leading up to that point?
Afterwards. We'll come back to the experiment in a second.
I think he realized, just as the Cybex was wrong about positive only, he realized negative only. Like there's that old saying, the sum of the parts doesn't exceed the sum of its whole. So I think he realized doing the full movement, positive, negative, is what is needed. And he said later, he never stepped up to prove that negative only was the best, is that it could produce good results. So he never really pushed negative only training. Just, he says, do not omit the negative, right? As opposed to just doing negative or just doing positive, right? So he didn't write much more after that about that.
So the experiment occurs.
Yeah.
It's roughly a month long.
Yeah.
And what were the results? Because especially the results Casey Viator got, the younger, more genetically blessed individual, what were the final numbers for him?
Casey took his body weight from 167 pounds up to 212 pounds, a gain of 45 pounds. Then Arthur took his weight from 144 up to 162. Now, they were using a fat testing device called the whole body counter, which supposedly measured the radiation given off by potassium in the lean body tissues. But so they thought Arthur lost close to 2% body fat, and Casey lost 17 pounds of body fat, which would have brought his muscle gain from 45 to 63 pounds, which had everybody going, jaw drop. What? This is impossible. Now, that whole body counter technique would be thrown out. Like 2 years later at West Point, they tried it and they used it. It wasn't accurate. So Arthur had expressed his doubt that Casey had lost 17 pounds, but still, it was a 45-pound gain. And when you look at the photos, you'll see that he was impressive at 167, but he's really impressive at 212 pounds. He still fell shy of his 218 pounds that he weighed at the Mr. America in 1971. Arthur, again, he only made it to 162 pounds. He never even made it back to his 180 pounds, but that he reached in 1968. But so there was always controversy about Casey's 63-pound gain of muscle, and of course everybody just believed he took steroids, right? And I had met Casey, and I had interviewed him again for the books, and Casey said, I'm not going to deny that he took steroids in his life, but he said he didn't take them to experiment because he said he's only regaining weight he already had. Arthur Jones, he said Arthur was offering him X number of dollars per pound of muscle gain, and it was the equivalent of a Corvette, and had Arthur got any wind at all of steroid use, the deal was off. And I talked to Kim Wood. Kim Wood was Arthur's right-hand man for many years. He ran Nautilus Midwest. He said his brother Tom went with Casey to try to maintain that no drug clause, right? So Casey was a genetic freak. Like I said, I met him. He's got the genetics for it, rebounding like that, because we got to talk about that aspect of what these guys actually did to get the results. But they gave Arthur what he wanted, a phenomenal marketing, a very hyper-inflated marketing vehicle that he wanted to put out there. And the universe, he went to war. There's a whole story that follows this that we don't have time for. But he got what he wanted out of that.
So even though both Arthur and Casey never attained a new best, they were still able to put on a substantial amount of muscle in a very short period of time, but there was no progress over what they had already achieved.
No, they didn't hit it. Arthur wasn't even close, because Arthur you can look at Arthur, we can actually look at this question a little bit later, but they never exceeded before what they had gained. It was just muscle reacquired, and they had starved themselves purposely for this. That we can talk about more on the other side if you want.
That's fantastic, Randy. And we are going to talk a little bit more about that after the break. We're back with Randy Roach talking about the Colorado experiment. And Randy, what I wanted to ask you about was, it's been many years, many decades since this experiment occurred. And if you were to even do a quick search online, you would see that it's very much in dispute whether or not the experiment even happened, let alone what the results were. What are your feelings on that from your own knowledge?
I've never heard any real doubt about whether it happened or not. It was just a matter, what I found, most people accept that it was done and the numbers were the numbers. But the fact that most believe Casey took steroids, and the fact that they didn't believe the fat loss, and the fact that they were regaining lost muscle. Like, there's been these claims all through history of bodybuilding in terms right from the Weeders to York to even afterwards in the 80s with the cybergenetics, where they're actually even getting, that's a total different topic. But it's just been, people have tried it too. Casey was a genetic freak, right? And Arthur had pretty good genetics for muscle too, but he really, he knew what he was doing. He knew how to wind up for this and get the results that he wanted. Again, Arthur, that was his character, that was his personality. It's just over the top. So that's what he wanted. He wanted to study to show, like, I can put lats on a garden rake, right? That's hyperbole. Arthur was just that kind of guy. And like I said, people started to, Arthur made a lot of enemies. So a lot of people just like to attack the Colorado experiment because they just don't like Arthur, right? But I believe there's a fair amount of validity to it. Whether Casey took steroids, I don't know. Maybe he did, but I did meet him, and the guy is just phenomenal. Unfortunately, he's passed away several years back. But many aspects of it, I think, were valid. And people are always, this game, everybody questions everybody else, right? So that's just normal. I don't even think twice about it.
So if we're going to assume that everything did happen and the results were the results and everything was reported accurately, then what, in your opinion, gave Casey those tremendous results? What produced those numbers? Okay,
we'll proceed with the notion that neither Arthur nor us, we believe that Casey lost 17 pounds. So let's look at a 45-pound weight gain as opposed to a 63-pound gain of pure muscle. Arthur knows about regaining strength and how fast he can gain. He knew that back in the 50s, how fast he could regain muscle. Arthur walked around always at 160. If he didn't work out, he weighed 160. And he came into that experiment. He starved himself down to 144 pounds. So he had himself wound up. Casey, again, remember, in December of 72, Casey did negative weight training. He brought his weight up to 200 pounds. Okay. So basically, he's for the next month he could recover from the accident, and he took a bad reaction to a shot too that almost killed him. So he on top of that, he purposely ate 800 calories a day to bring his body weight down to 167. He still looks good at 167. You see the pictures of him?
I have.
Yeah, I remember though. Like, they said, man, the guys, I wouldn't mind looking like that. But they knew when he came in, and untrained, starving, that it was just going to rebound. That's what we call rebound training. And a guy like Casey could put probably that kind of weight on in that period of time, because he was eating, like, I think 500 grams of protein a day, and these are mostly real foods, and it was lower in fat and lower in carbohydrate. So sometimes that environment alone can bring some body fat off, but he just ate and trained, but he didn't overtrain. He got a good, I think 2 hours, just over 2 hours of training a week, but it was very intense, it was negative, it was positive. And I think a guy like that, he was kind of emaciated, but very starved down, they're going to regain the muscle fast. It's like when you break your arm and go to the cast or your leg, the cast comes off, your muscle comes back way faster than muscle memory than it did the first time to build it up, right?
So we got an interesting combination of someone who has superior genetics,
yeah,
may or may not have had anabolic help, but had already been at a very high level of muscular body weight and muscular strength, being trained. And that's the other thing, even personal training, someone pushing you was something that wasn't as terribly common back then. I mean, some of these guys had training partners, but that was about it. And even a financial gain if he did everything right. It's, in my opinion, a tremendously powerful set of circumstances to produce those results.
Yeah, Arthur was lucky at Casey. He was going to be originally the only guy. I think they talked about his son Gary. But Arthur himself was not a marketing board for Nautilus because he claimed himself to back in 1954 to have brought his body weight up to 205 muscular at just under 5'8". Now, no drugs. That's bigger, the same size as 5 Mr. Olympias on steroids. Nobody's got to see any pictures of Arthur like that. Nobody ever saw Arthur like that. So we had to take his word for it. And at that time, he didn't train. He got those results because just after the war, he was training about 7 days a week, 4 hours a day, which is crazy. So then he started training the traditional 3 days a week, 3 hours a day. Okay. And then he said when he cut that in half from 4 sets to 2 sets, and he grew tremendously. I think he said he could later cut the exercises down to from 12 to 8, and he brought his body weight up to 205. But a couple of years later, he was right back down to 160 because that's when Boyer Coe had met him. So Arthur wasn't that big. So when he, at his early 40s, it's a dispute over his age, whether he was 42 or 46 in 1968, when he brought his body weight back up down 180, he should have been able to hit that weight if he's natural and never took steroids. I was thinking, hey, he fell 25 pounds short. And again, when he tried it in 72, he couldn't even hit 180, he hit 169. And then the Colorado experiment, and then body was down 1 to 60. So Arthur's going backwards, going back to 1954. So it's a good thing he had Casey there because when I looked at Arthur Jones, I spent several years and looking at the numbers and all that stuff, and I thought he got great results with a barbell and chins and dips. And he trained a lot longer. Most 2/3 of his routine was rest. If he was training for 3 hours, he was resting for 2 of those hours because the sets that he was doing just wouldn't take that long. So by collapsing it all down, other than Casey, neither Arthur nor the cadets at the West Point study that 2 years later got those same results.
So we got about a minute left, Randy. My last question would be, do you think that could be, or the experiment could be replicated today?
Well, many have. Josh Trentini has tried it twice over the years. It's just a matter of you have the right. You don't have to have the exact equipment. You just got to be willing to starve yourself down for a few months and say that you're well underneath your muscular body weight, and come in and train same way Arthur did. You're going to gain. You might not gain like Casey did, but you're going to gain. If you don't, I think you should get out of the game, right? Because you're just going to gain muscle. It is, and it'll be based relative to the person's genetics, right?
That's great, Randy. I really appreciate you being on the show today and sharing your knowledge with us. If one of the viewers wanted to get a hold of you, what would be the best method of reaching you?
My website at randyroach.ca. Contact me through there.
That's great. Thank you again for being on the show today, Randy.
Thanks, Mike.